Starfleet has catalogued thousands of species, mapped the boundaries of known space, and negotiated peace with civilizations that once seemed incomprehensible. But what happens when something arrives that defies every sensor, every medical database, every rational framework the Federation has ever constructed? What happens when the darkness between dimensions tears open, and something steps through that was born to hunt the dark itself? Deep Space Nine hung in the black like an iron crown, its docking pylons stretched wide against the slow burn of the Bajoran wormhole's distant shimmer. It was 0200 station time, and the promenade had gone quiet. The Quarks crowd thinned to a few stubborn Dabo players and one Balian merchant sleeping across a bar stool. Constable Odo made his rounds in silence, his footsteps precise and unhurried, his expression carrying the permanent dissatisfaction of a man who found the universe perpetually short of order. He had been troubled for 11 days. 6 crew members, 2 Bajoran civilians, a Starfleet ensign, a Balian technician, and 2 independent traders, had been found in their quarters in states of complete neural collapse. Alive, breathing, but emptied. Federation medical science had no explanation. Bashir had run every scan available and returned with the same answer each time. Their neural electrical pathways had been systematically drained, as though something had reached inside their minds and consumed the signal without touching the hardware. Odo didn't believe in coincidence. He believed in predators. He was crossing the upper level of the promenade when the station shuddered. It was subtle. A harmonic vibration running through the deck plating, the kind that preceded a warp core fluctuation or a localized subspace event. Odo paused, one hand resting on the railing, and looked toward the viewport. Outside, near docking pylon 3, the space between the stars had begun to fold. It lasted 4 seconds. A vertical tear, roughly 2 meters tall, edges burning with Cherenkov blue radiation. And then something fell through it. He hit the deck of the exterior docking corridor with the kind of impact that should have broken both legs. Instead, he rolled, a trained, fluid motion, came up in a combat stance, blades already drawn, scanning his environment with eyes that caught the low light like a predator's. He was a black man in his mid-30s, built like violence-given architecture, dressed in a long leather coat that had seen more battles than most starships. Twin short swords gleamed in his hands, their edges etched with symbols that meant nothing to Federation linguistics databases but suggested, unmistakably, that they had been made to kill something specific. A modified sidearm was holstered across his chest. A bandolier of glass vials, pale amber fluid, crossed his torso. His jaw was set. His eyes swept the corridor once, twice, catalogued it, and then he did something that Odo would later describe in his security report as the most tactically disciplined response to dimensional displacement I have ever witnessed. He checked his serum supply first. Then he looked for threats. "Station," he said, to no one in particular. His voice was low and flat, the voice of a man who had long since burned away anything that wasn't useful. "Different. Not home." He looked at the curvature of the corridor, the Cardassian design geometry, the quality of the light. Definitely not home. The security alarm reached him 3 seconds later. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Trek universe, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. Live long and prosper. Odo was already moving toward the corridor, his comm badge open. Security teams to docking pylon 3. Unknown individual, armed, possible dimensional incursion. Non-lethal containment only. A pause. Alert Commander Cisco. Blade heard the footsteps coming from 2 directions before the first officer rounded the corner. 4 of them, moving fast, carrying weapons he didn't recognize but could read by posture alone. Ranged weapons, energy-based, currently set to something below lethal. He had been taken in by worse. He had also killed worse. He made a rapid calculation. Unknown environment, unknown faction, no confirmed vampire presence yet, no strategic value in a fight. And made a decision that surprised even him. He sheathed the blades. Slowly. Deliberately. Hands visible. The security team came around both corners simultaneously and stopped. Odo materialized between them a moment later, studying the figure in the leather coat with the focused attention of a man cataloging a new species. Blade studied him back. Something registered, the slight imprecision of Odo's features, the way light moved across his skin differently than it should. Not human. Not exactly anything Blade had a name for. "You're not biological," Blade said. It wasn't a question. Odo's expression didn't change. "And you arrived through a dimensional rift while carrying enough edged weapons to arm a small militia." He clasped his hands behind his back. "I think introductions are in order." Blade said nothing for a moment. He was still scanning. Not the security team. Not Odo. The middle distance. The way a man does when he's already thinking past the current problem. "Something's wrong with this station," he said finally. Odo's eyes narrowed by a fraction. "What makes you say that?" Blade looked at him directly for the first time. "Because I can smell it." Commander Benjamin Sisko had faced Borg cubes, Dominion ultimatums, and the inscrutable silence of the prophets themselves. He had learned, through hard experience, that the universe reserved its strangest deliveries for the hours when a man most wanted sleep. He arrived at the security office at 0231, still pulling his uniform straight, and found Odo standing outside the holding cell with the expression he reserved for problems that didn't fit existing categories. Inside the cell, Blade sat on the bench with his coat still on, arms resting on his knees, perfectly still. Not the stillness of a man resigned to captivity. The stillness of a man conserving energy while he thought. "Report," Cisco said. "Humanoid male. Arrived via dimensional rift near Pylon 3, confirmed by external sensors, Cherenkov radiation signature consistent with a brief interuniversal aperture. No vessel. No transporter trace. He came through alone." Odo paused. "He's carrying 11 edged weapons, 2 modified energy sidearms, and 14 vials of an unidentified amber compound. Bashir's preliminary scan indicates he's human, approximately 94%. The remaining 6% is something our medical database cannot classify." Cisco looked through the cell barrier. "Has he been cooperative?" "He hasn't been uncooperative. He also hasn't said much beyond his name." Odo's voice carried the particular dryness of a man who respected efficiency. Blade. No other designation offered. Cisco studied the figure in the cell for a moment, then made a decision. He stepped forward and deactivated the comm barrier, not the containment field, just the audio block. Blade looked up. His eyes moved to Cisco with the same measuring quality they'd given everything else, assessing rank, threat level, intent. "I'm Commander Benjamin Sisko. This is Deep Space Nine, a Federation starbase in the Bajoran system." Cisco kept his voice level and direct. He'd found that worked better than diplomatic preamble with individuals who were clearly not interested in it. "You want to tell me what you are and where you came from?" Blade was quiet for 3 seconds. "Depends on whether you're going to use the answer to dissect me. That's not how we operate. Every institution says that." Blade leaned back slightly. "I'm a Dhampir. Half human, half vampire. I hunt vampires. In my reality, they're the apex predator humanity doesn't know it's living alongside. I was mid-hunt when your dimensional tier pulled me through." He said it the way a man recites a maintenance report, factual, stripped of drama. "I'm not your enemy. I'm not asking for asylum. I want my weapons back and I want to understand what's feeding on your crew." The silence that followed was considerable. Cisco glanced at Odo, whose expression had shifted from careful neutrality to something approaching reluctant interest. "You know about the comatose crew members," Cisco said. "I know the smell. Neural electrical drain, long exposure, targeted feeding. Whatever's doing it has been here for a while and it's patient. Patient means intelligent. Intelligent means it knows you can't identify it." Blade's jaw tightened. "Which means it's already wearing a face you trust." Cisco returned to Odo. "Get Bashir down here. Full biological workup, with the subject's consent. He looked back at Blade. I'm not releasing your weapons yet. But I'm not treating you as a prisoner either. I need to understand what we're dealing with before I decide how much of what you're telling me is useful and how much is a problem. Blade almost smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. Smart. Dr. Julian Bashir arrived 12 minutes later with a medical tricorder and the barely contained excitement of a man presented with a biological impossibility before breakfast. He had the decency to mostly hide it. His skin took 4 minutes, during which Blade sat with the patience of a statue and Bashir's tricorder beeped with increasing frequency. Remarkable, Bashir said for the third time, before apparently deciding that was unhelpful. Your cellular structure shows standard human baseline overlaid with a secondary biological framework, enhanced musculature, accelerated mitochondrial activity, a modified immune response that produces compounds I've never seen synthesized naturally. He lowered the tricorder. Your healing rate alone is faster than it should be. Yes. Blade looked at the amber vials, now laid in a sealed tray on Bashir's side of the barrier. The serum suppresses the vampire's side. Without it, I develop bloodlust. I need that supply maintained. Whatever's in your replicators, I can give you the chemical breakdown. Bashir nodded, already entering notes. The compound is complex but not beyond our replication capability. I'll need a sample and take what you need. Blade's eyes moved back to Cisco. Clock's running, Commander. Neural drain at that level. 6 victims over 11 days. That's a feeding cycle. It'll accelerate. Whatever's here is getting comfortable. Cisco pulled a chair and sat, forearms on his knees, meeting Blade's gaze directly. It was a posture that said, I am taking you seriously. It was also a posture that said, I haven't decided what to do with you yet. If what you're describing is real, an intelligent predator hiding within my crew, then Starfleet protocol requires a full investigation through proper channels. Quarantine assessments, sensor sweeps, interviews. That'll take weeks, Blade said flatly. And it'll spook whatever's here. You'll find empty corridors and another body. Then help me move faster. Cisco stood. But you do it inside my authority, not around it. This station has 4 distinct civilian populations, a Bajoran militia contingent, and Starfleet personnel. I can't have an armed operative running unsanctioned operations through my corridors. A pause. Are we clear? Blade looked at him for a long moment. Whatever calculation ran behind those eyes, it completed quickly. Clear, he said. It was not auto-reflected later, a promise. It was an acknowledgement. There was a meaningful difference. And he suspected that before this was finished, that difference would matter considerably. Bashir's ward smelled like recycled air and antiseptic. Clean, controlled, Federation orderly. Blade stood at the threshold and felt the wrongness before he crossed it. 6 biobeds. 6 patients in varying states of neural vacancy. Eyes open in some cases, tracking nothing. Bodies breathing with the automatic indifference of machines whose operator had stepped away. Blade moved slowly between them, hands at his sides, reading the room the way he'd learned to read crime scenes before forensics had a name. Not with instruments. With instinct refined by 20 years of hunting things that left no evidence conventional investigators could process. Bashir stood near the door with a tricorder he wasn't using. Odo stood closer, watching Blade with the focused attention of a man filing everything for later. How long between first victim and second? Blade asked. 3 days, Bashir said. Between 5th and 6th? 18 hours. Blade nodded slowly. Accelerating cycle. The creature was either growing bolder, growing hungry, or both. He crouched beside the nearest patient, a young Bajoran woman, her earring catching the light, and studied her face without touching her. Her expression was peaceful in the specific way that indicated the neural pathways governing distress had been selectively stripped. Not random consumption. Surgical. It doesn't just feed, he said. It savors. takes the emotional register first, fear, anxiety, then works inward toward core cognitive function. Leaves the autonomic system intact because a dead host attracts more attention than a vacant one. He stood. This isn't desperation feeding. This is a species that has done this for a very long time and considers itself careful. Bashir lowered his tricorder. Our scans showed no foreign biological material. No toxins, no injection sites, no. It doesn't go through the skin. Blade turned toward him. Neural electrical predators make contact through proximity and resonance. Close quarters, sustained duration. Minutes, not seconds. Whoever's doing this spent extended time alone with each of these people in an enclosed space. He looked at Odo. You have logs. Comprehensive ones, Odo said. I've reviewed them. Nothing anomalous. Then it knows where your blind spots are. Blade's voice didn't carry accusation, only the flat certainty of someone reading a familiar playbook. It's been here long enough to map your security coverage. That's months of observation before the first feeding. He looked around the ward once more. It didn't come through the rift with me. It was already here. The implications settled over the room like a drop in atmospheric pressure. Bashir spoke first, quietly. That means it arrived independently. Before Blade. Before the rift. Through the wormhole? Odo said. It wasn't quite a question. Or it was already in this sector, and the station gave it exactly what it needed. Blade moved toward the door. A contained population. Controlled entry points. A security apparatus focused outward, on the Dominion, on shipping on the wormhole, rather than inward. He paused at the threshold. It picked this place deliberately. Odo followed him into the corridor. Cisco had authorized a provisional working arrangement. Blade would have supervised access to non-classified areas of the station in exchange for sharing everything he identified. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, which Odo privately considered a reasonable indicator that it was the correct decision. You said you could smell it, Odo said, keeping pace. On the docking corridor when you arrived. Trace biological resonance. Neural electrical predators emit a low-frequency chemo signal during feeding, metabolic exhaust. Undetectable to standard humanoid senses. I'm not standard. Blade's eyes moved continuously as they walked the promenade's lower level, not nervously, but with the systematic coverage of someone maintaining situational awareness in a target-rich environment. The signal is faint here. Ambient. The creature fed recently but not nearby. How recently? Within the last 6 hours. Odo's jaw tightened fractionally. There's no seventh victim in the medical bay. No, Blade agreed. Which means either Bashir missed someone, unlikely, or this one hasn't collapsed yet. The feeding was interrupted or voluntary. The creature pulled back before completing the cycle. He stopped walking. They were outside the entrance to Quark's, the ambient noise of the bar filtering through the doors. It's rationing. It knows you're looking. It's going to ground. Which makes it more dangerous, Odo said. Always does. Blade looked at him directly. You're not fully biological either. Your chemo signal is different. It registers as a gap rather than a presence. The creature will have noted that. It knows you can't be fed upon. A pause. It may have already calculated that you're the greatest threat to its concealment. Odo absorbed this without visible reaction. Then it will attempt to neutralize me or discredit my investigation. That's what I do, Blade said. He resumed walking. Tell me about your command staff. Senior officers. Who has unrestricted access to every section of this station? The question was not casual. Odo recognized it immediately for what it was, not an inquiry, but the opening move of an elimination process. Blade wasn't asking who the crew were. He was asking who the creature could be. Odo fell into step beside him and began, methodically, to answer. The promenade at 0900 was a different creature than its midnight incarnation, loud, crowded, layered with the overlapping commerce and conversation of 4 distinct species going about their morning business. Blade moved through it like a current moving against the tide, unhurried but directional, reading the crowd with the practiced detachment of a man who had spent decades in environments where any face could be a mask. Odo had given him a provisional security clearance. Restricted, monitored, non-weaponized for the moment, though Blade had retained 2 concealed blades that Odo had chosen not to officially acknowledge. It was a pragmatic arrangement. Odo understood predators. He understood that declawing a hunter and then pointing him at prey produced worse outcomes than controlled deployment. Blade had spent 3 hours reviewing station logs, crew rotations, access records, the location data of every individual within proximity of each victim in the hours preceding their collapse. He had cross-referenced it manually, without the assistance of the computer, because he didn't trust algorithms to weight the variables he was weighting. The computer looked for anomalies in behavior. Blade was looking for the absence of anomalies, the unnatural smoothness of someone who had been careful for a very long time. 2 names had surfaced. Not as suspects. As patterns. A Balian civilian trader named Yelm Koss had been present within 50 meters of 4 of the 6 victims within 12 hours of their respective collapses. His station logs were impeccable, almost aggressively mundane. Regular Dabo games at Quarks, regular cargo shipments through the lower docking ring, regular meals at the replimat. A man with no reason to be remarkable had achieved the rare feat of never once being remarkable. The second pattern was more troubling. A Starfleet lieutenant, a human woman named Reyes, assigned to habitat operations, appeared in the access logs for 3 of the victims' residential corridors within hours of each incident. Her schedule explained 2 of the 3 appearances. The third had no logged purpose. One explanation was oversight. The other explanation was that she had been careful enough to account for most of her movements, but not all of them. Blade found Yelm Koss at the Dabo table at 0922, exactly where his logs suggested he would be. The Balian was a broad, cheerful man in his 50s, blue skin creased with laugh lines, engaging a Bajoran woman in the animated discussion of someone who had perfected the social performance of harmlessness. Blade took a seat at the bar 20 feet away and ordered something called a ractigino that tasted like coffee filtered through a warp manifold. He drank it without complaint and watched. Koss laughed at something. His eyes moved across the room in the laugh's cover, fast, comprehensive, professionally casual. Blade's hand tightened slightly around the mug. There it was. Not the laugh. The scan inside the laugh. The involuntary predator behavior of a creature assessing its environment even in moments of apparent relaxation. Humanoid predators faked ease but couldn't entirely suppress the threat assessment reflex. It surfaced in eye movement, in the micro pause before relaxing into a new position, in the way the body subtly oriented toward exits. Koss had just done all 3 in 1.4 seconds. Blade set down the mug and activated his comm badge, the temporary unit Odo had assigned him. Blade to Odo. Odo here. Your Balian traitor. Yelm Koss. Where has he been granted access beyond standard civilian clearance? A pause. The sound of a console. Habitat Ring B, levels 4 through 7. Granted 2 months ago for a cargo delivery contract. The contract concluded 6 weeks ago. The access was never revoked. Another pause, shorter this time. No. It wasn't. All 6 victims were in Habitat Ring B. Blade stood, keeping his body language loose. Don't move on him yet. If he runs, we lose the intelligence. I need to know if he's alone. Understood. I'm pulling his full bioscan from entry logs. Odo's voice dropped half a register. Blade. If this is what you believe it is, the Prime Directive doesn't apply here. This isn't a pre-warp civilization, but Starfleet protocols on apprehension. I know, Blade said. I'm not going to kill him in the middle of a bar. That's somewhat reassuring. Blade was already moving toward the exit, angling wide of Koss, staying in peripheral vision rather than direct sideline. The Balian's laugh tracked him for 1 second too long before returning to the Dabo table. Confirmation. The creature had registered him as a variable, not a threat yet, but something new in the environment that hadn't been there before. Something that required assessment. Blade stepped out onto the upper promenade walkway and leaned against the railing, looking out over the commercial floor below. Kos was visible through the bar's open entrance, still playing Dabo, still performing normalcy. He'd been hunting vampires for 20 years. The specifics changed, biology, methodology, world, but the core behavior never did. Every predator species that had survived long enough to develop intelligence had arrived at the same fundamental strategy: become indistinguishable from the prey population, feed slowly enough to avoid triggering a response, and when attention comes, be the last one anyone suspects. Young Kos had been on this station for 7 months. He had fed 6 times in 11 days. He was accelerating. And somewhere in Blade's instincts, the part that wasn't science or logic, the part that had kept him alive in the dark for 2 decades, something said Kos wasn't operating alone. He pulled up the access logs on his temporary PADD and looked again at Lieutenant Reyes. The third unexplained corridor appearance looked back at him. Odo had spent the better part of his adult life surrounded by people who underestimated him. It was, he had concluded, an occupational asset. The shapeshifter who looked like an approximation of a face was rarely the one a suspect watched most carefully. He used the invisibility of his strangeness the way other investigators use surveillance technology, by being present in plain sight, catalogued and dismissed. He found Blade in a maintenance corridor on level 4 of Habitat Ring B, crouched beside a ventilation access panel with the focused stillness of someone reading a text no one else could see. "You were right about the access logs," Odo said, keeping his voice low. The corridor was empty but sound carried in Cardassian construction. The original architects had apparently considered acoustic monitoring a feature. "Reyes has a second unexplained appearance I missed in the initial review. 5 weeks ago, Habitat Ring B, Level 6. Victim number 3's corridor, 4 hours before collapse." Blade didn't look up. "She's not the same species as Kos." Odo went still. "Explain." "Kos emits the chemosignal I told you about. Metabolic exhaust from neurofeeding. It's faint, he fed at least 48 hours ago, but it's present." Blade stood and looked at Odo directly. "Reyes doesn't have it. Her signal is different. Closer to the residue I'd expect from a recently fed-upon victim, except she's not comatose." He paused. "She's been fed upon repeatedly over an extended period. Small amounts. Sustainable. She doesn't know what's happening to her. Kos is using her," Odo said slowly, "as a resource he manages. And as access. She works habitat operations. She has legitimate reasons to be anywhere in the ring. He feeds lightly enough that she functions normally. Tired, maybe, occasional headaches, nothing she'd report to Bashir." Blade's expression was not quite anger. It was the particular flatness of a man who had seen this methodology before and found its efficiency repugnant. "She's not complicit. She's livestock." The word landed hard in the corridor's silence. Odo clasped his hands behind his back and processed the geometry of the situation. If Kos has been managing Reyes as a sustainable feeding source for months, the 6 comatose victims represent something different. Either his appetite has grown beyond what she can sustain, or he has others of his kind to feed. "Both," Blade said. "The acceleration of the feeding cycle isn't one predator getting careless. It's the resource demand of a group." He moved to the corridor junction and looked both ways before continuing. "How many individuals have arrived on this station in the last 8 months that weren't fully vetted through Federation bioscan?" Odo's expression shifted in the way it did when the answer to a question was worse than anticipated. "The Dominion buildup has diverted significant Starfleet resources. Our intake protocols for civilian traders and independent contractors have been operating at reduced scrutiny since..." He stopped. 7 months ago. When Kos arrived. When Kos arrived. Odo confirmed. The timeline's implication was unambiguous and unpleasant. He came during the window when we were least equipped to screen for something our sensors weren't calibrated to detect. They're patient, Blade said. I told you that. This wasn't opportunistic. Someone sent them here, or they chose this moment deliberately. He turned back toward Odo. I need access to the complete civilian intake manifest for the last 8 months. Cross-referenced with current station population. Anyone who arrived in that window and is still aboard. I can have that within the hour. Odo paused. Cisco needs to be briefed. If there's a coordinated group of predatory entities within this station's population, this moves beyond a security matter into a command decision. Yes. Blade picked up the PADD from the floor where he'd set it. Brief him. But keep the circle small. If Koss has been here long enough to map your security protocols, he has sources. Someone on your staff reports interesting information for Latinum, or favors, or simply because they don't know they're being cultivated. His eyes met Odo's. You trust your senior staff? I trust their intentions, Odo said carefully. I verify everything else. Blade almost nodded, a fractional movement that suggested the response had risen marginally in his estimation. Good enough. They moved together toward the Habitat Ring's central hub, an unlikely partnership in the corridor's low amber lighting, the shapeshifter who had spent his life finding a shape that fit, and the damper who had spent his life refusing to be defined by the thing that made him different. Mather acknowledged the parallel. Both were aware of it. Odo spoke as they reached the turbolift. When we identify the full group, what's the methodology? Blade looked at him. Containment and extraction. Alive if possible. I need to understand whether they're isolated here or part of a larger network that found its way through the wormhole. And if containment isn't possible? The turbolift arrived. Blade stepped inside. Then we don't let them reach the wormhole. Odo stepped in beside him. The doors closed. The turbolift hummed. The Federation, Odo said after a moment, has protocols for the trial and detention of predatory species. Due process applies regardless of. I know, Blade said. He was looking at the doors. I'm not going to enjoy agreeing with that. But I know. Odo said nothing. He filed the response carefully. It was, he thought, the most promising thing Blade had said since arriving. The briefing room off ops had the particular tension of a space where difficult truths were being arranged before delivery. Cisco sat at the head of the table with the stillness of a man who had learned to absorb bad news without letting it show on his face before he'd finished hearing it. Kira stood near the viewport. Worf occupied the corner with his arms folded, reassessing Blade with the focused attention of a Klingon recalculating a threat index. Dax sat with a stylus and a PDD, her expression engaged and carefully neutral. Odo laid out the full picture in 9 minutes. Blade added 3 specific details that Odo's framing had compressed: the chemosignal methodology, the managed feeding of Lieutenant Reyes, the deliberate timing of the group's arrival during DS9's reduced intake screening. When they finished, Cisco was quiet for 4 seconds. How many? He said. The intake manifest cross-reference identified 7 individuals who arrived in the relevant window and remain aboard with incomplete bioscan records, Odo said. Koss is confirmed. The other 6 are probabilities, not certainties. We need biological verification for each. Through what mechanism? Dax asked. Our sensors aren't calibrated for this species. They can be, Bashir said from the end of the table. He had been listening with the contained urgency of a doctor whose patients were still unconscious in his ward. Now that Blade has provided the chemosignal parameters, I can adjust our internal sensor array to detect the metabolic exhaust pattern. It won't be immediate. I'm estimating 4 to 6 hours to recalibrate, but it will give us an accurate picture of who aboard this station is a Voth Kali. Do it, Cisco said. He looked at Blade. You said the timing of their arrival was deliberate. You believe they came here with a specific objective beyond feeding. Feeding sustains them. It's not a mission. Blade leaned forward slightly. The wormhole is the objective. A stable passage between two quadrants. If a predator species is mapping expansion routes, that's not infrastructure you ignore. They've been here long enough to understand what it is and what it connects to. He paused. If the Gamma Quadrant has prey populations the Dominion hasn't fully controlled, the Voth-Kali just found themselves a door. The room absorbed this. Worf spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the particular weight of someone who had been waiting for the correct moment. If this species preceded even the Bajoran prophets in this sector, they may have traversed the wormhole before its modern discovery. They may consider this region ancestral territory. He looked at Cisco. That is not a species that will accept containment quietly. No, Blade agreed. It's not. The door chimed and opened before Cisco could respond. The figure who entered was not on the briefing's guest list, a Cardassian in civilian dress, the kind of civilian dress that fit too precisely and moved too efficiently for a man with no military background. He had the angular features and careful smile of someone who had spent a career in intelligence, and retired nothing so much as the habit of it. Forgive the interruption, Commander. His voice was smooth, without the particular oiliness of apology. Garrick. Simple Taylor. I was asked to deliver a message to your security chief. His eyes moved to Odo, and found myself informed that the meeting was relevant to my message's subject matter. By whom? Kira said sharply. A mutual acquaintance, Garrick said pleasantly, which answered nothing. He set a data chip on the table. Cardassian intelligence has been tracking the Voth-Kali for 11 years. They are not a newly discovered species. They are a species the Obsidian Order documented extensively before its dissolution. The Order identified 3 separate Voth-Kali population nodes in the Alpha Quadrant. A pause that was calibrated to land. And spent the last 4 years attempting to weaponize them. The silence was absolute. Cisco picked up the data chip. Weaponize. A predator species that can feed selectively, mimic any humanoid form it has studied, and leave no biological trace detectable by standard Federation or Klingon sensors. Garrick tilted his head. The strategic applications are considerable. A Voth-Kali placed within a Dominion command structure, feeding on key founders or Vorta, the cascade effects on the Dominion War could be significant. The Obsidian Order is gone, Odo said. The Order is gone, Garrick agreed. Its research is not. And there are those within the current Cardassian Union who believe that research represents an asset worth recovering. His eyes moved to Blade with the candid curiosity of a man encountering something genuinely new. Though I confess the current situation has acquired variables the original planners didn't anticipate. Blade looked at him with the flat assessment, he gave everything. You want them contained, not destroyed. I want them understood, Garrick said. There's a distinction. There isn't, Blade said. Not with this species. Cisco set the data chip down. Garrick. Sit down and tell me everything the Obsidian Order documented. All of it. We'll determine what's actionable afterward. He looked around the table, his gaze settling on Blade last. Nobody moves against any of the 7 individuals on that manifest until Bashir's sensor recalibration is complete, and we have confirmed identities. We do this right. Blade said nothing. He was looking at the data chip. In the Cardassian intelligence files, if they were complete, there might be information about Voth-Kali group behavior, pack dynamics, hierarchy, what happened when a hunting group felt cornered. What happened when cornered was always the most important thing to know. Lieutenant Reyes had been experiencing what she'd privately catalogued as a difficult month. Low energy. Persistent headaches that Bashir's biobed attributed to sleep disruption and elevated stress. Reasonable diagnoses for anyone serving on a station at the edge of a war. She'd accepted them without much examination, the way people accept explanations that are almost right. Almost right was comfortable. Almost right didn't require further investigation. She was running a diagnostic on Habitat Ring B's atmospheric processing when Blade fell into step beside her. She didn't startle. That was the first thing he noticed. Her threat response was muted. Not professionally suppressed the way a trained officer's might be, but organically blunted. The Voth-Kali's sustained feeding had skimmed the neurological layer where alarm responses were generated. She was calmer than a person in her situation should be. It made her seem easygoing. It made her dangerous to herself. "Lieutenant Reyes," he said. She looked at him with mild curiosity. The unfamiliar face registered, filed, moved on. "Can I help you? I don't think we've met." "We haven't. I'm working with Constable Odo on a security matter." He kept his pace matched to hers, his voice conversational. "How long have you been assigned to Habitat Ring B operations?" 7 months, she said. "Since the Dominion buildup started pulling extra personnel too." She paused. "Is this about the people in the med bay? The coma cases?" Tangentially. He watched her face. No micro-expression spike at the topic. Either she was extraordinarily controlled, or she genuinely had no conscious awareness of her connection to the victims. The latter, he was certain. "Do you know a civilian traitor named Yelm Kas?" The answer came a half-second too slowly. Not suspiciously, but the way a name produces a slight pleasant association before the verbal response catches up. "Kas? Yes, he's a regular at Quark's. We've talked a few times. He's—" She stopped again, frowning now. "He's always around when I'm doing the Ring B rounds, actually." "Has he ever been in your quarters?" The frown deepened. "Once. I wasn't feeling well. I think I'd just finished a double shift. And he walked me back and made sure I was settled." She said it with the warm imprecision of someone recalling a feeling more than a memory. He was very kind. The feeding event was in that gap. Blade was certain of it. He kept his voice even. "I need you to do something for me, Lieutenant. Go to the medical bay right now and tell Dr. Bashir you need a full neuropathway diagnostic. Tell him it's in connection with the security investigation. He'll know what to look for." She looked at him with the first real attention she'd given the conversation. "Is something wrong with me?" "We're checking," he said. "Precaution." He held her gaze for a moment. "Don't contact Kas before you go. Don't mention this conversation to anyone who isn't Odo, Cisco, or Bashir." She nodded slowly, the gravity of the instruction reaching her despite the muted alarm response. Something in her, below the level the Voth-Kali had reached, recognized that she was being told something important. He watched her go, then activated his comm badge. "Odo. Here. Bashir's sensor recalibration. How close?" "He says 90 minutes. Tell him 80. Kas made me in Quarks this morning. He's had 6 hours to brief his group." Blade moved toward the turbolift. "They're going to run. The station is on internal lockdown per Cisco's order. No departing vessels without." "They don't need a vessel." Blade stopped walking. The realization arrived with the cold clarity of something that should have been obvious sooner. The wormhole. It opened twice in the last 12 hours for Bajoran transport vessels. A Voth-Kali holding humanoid form could have walked aboard either one without triggering any alert our current sensors would catch. The pause on Odo's end was brief. "I'm pulling the transport manifests. Pull them. And get me to Kas now." Ahead of the sensor sweep. "I need him contained before he decides that running isn't an option and feeding becomes a weapon. A cornered predator with the ability to drain a humanoid nervous system in sustained proximity was not a security problem. It was a medical emergency on legs." The turbolift opened onto the promenade level. Blade stepped out and immediately felt the chemo signal shift, stronger, closer, the metabolic signature of a Voth-Kali, an active physiological response. Not feeding. The opposite. The biochemical profile of a predator moving toward a decision. Kas was no longer at the Dabo table. Blade scanned the promenade in 3 seconds. The crowd moved with normal morning density. A Bajoran family near the replimat. 2 Starfleet officers reviewing a PDD. A Ferengi arguing with a Balian near. Not Kas. A different Balian. The real cost was already gone. But the chemo signal was still present. Close. Moving. Blade turned toward the habitat ring entrance and started to run. 3 levels up, in a maintenance corridor that Starfleet's internal sensors hadn't flagged in the current lockdown parameters, young Koss stood with 2 others, either of them wearing the faces they'd arrived with. They had received word 18 minutes ago. They had been patient for 7 months. Patience, they understood, had a terminal point. The question now was whether the door out of this station could be opened before the hunter reached them. The answer depended on how fast he was. They had no idea. Cisco received 3 things simultaneously at 1347 station time: Odo's alert that Blade was in active pursuit on Habitat Ring B, Bashir's confirmation that Reyes showed extensive neural pathway degradation consistent with sustained predatory feeding, and Worf's report that the internal sensor recalibration had completed 40 minutes ahead of schedule. The sensor sweep results came back in 11 seconds. 7 confirmed Voth-Kali biosignatures aboard Deep Space Nine. 3 were mobile and moving in a coordinated pattern toward the lower docking ring. 4 were stationary, distributed across the habitat and commercial sections, maintaining their cover positions. The sweep also returned 1 additional reading that Bashir had to look at twice before he understood it: a partial biosignature in the habitat ring maintenance corridor that wasn't on any manifest because it wasn't wearing any face it had used to board the station. A Voth-Kali in its base form, unmasked, which meant cornered. "Red alert," Cisco said. "All hands. Odo, coordinate with Blade, do not get ahead of him in that corridor. Worf, seal the lower docking ring, all bays. Kira, I need a channel to the Bajoran transports that departed in the last 12 hours. If any Voth-Kali made it aboard, those ships need to know." The ops center moved with the controlled urgency of a crew that had survived the Dominion and didn't frighten easily. Cisco looked at the sensor display showing Blade's position, the borrowed comm badge placing him 40 meters from the 3 mobile Voth-Kali and closing. He opened a channel. "Cisco to Blade." "Go," Blade said. He was running. The audio confirmed it. 7 confirmed. 3 mobile, heading for lower docking. 4 stationary, holding position. The mobile 3 are ahead of you by 40 meters and they know you're coming. A pause. "We need at least 1 alive for Federation questioning." "Define alive loosely," Blade said. Cisco decided to take that as agreement. In the maintenance corridor, Blade rounded the junction and found them waiting. They had dropped the pretense of Balian physiognomy, all 3 of them, standing in the amber maintenance lighting in their baseline form. The Voth-Kali without a mask were striking in the dispassionate way that something engineered purely for function was striking. Elongated cranial structure, bioluminescent tendrils retracted flat against the forearm, skin that shifted between gray and deep violet as their metabolic state changed. They were tall. They regarded him with the intelligent stillness of predators that had never, in their evolutionary history, been the ones being hunted. Koss, or the entity that had warned Koss, spoke first. Its translator processed the vocalization into Federation standard with the slight delay of an unfamiliar language matrix. "You are not from this universe." "No," Blade said. He'd stopped 10 meters back. Twin blades out. UV emitters activated on the modified sidearm. He didn't know if UV affected this species, but the Voth-Kali didn't know he didn't know, which was its own tactical value. "You are the same as us," it said. "Predator. Defined by what you consume." "I've heard that argument," Blade said. "It's wrong every time." The second Voth-Kali moved, fast, lateral, trying to flank. Blade was already rotating, the blade coming up in a tight arc that caught the tendrils mid-extension and severed 2 of the 4. The creature screamed in a frequency that bypassed the ears and hit the inner vestibular system directly, disorienting, designed to produce immediate vertigo in prey species. Blade's half-vampire physiology processed it as unpleasant rather than incapacitating. He drove the pommel of the second blade into the creature's cranial structure with enough force to drop it, living, to the deck. 1 down. The third Vothkali had reached the maintenance hatch behind them and was 4 seconds from a corridor that would scatter them into the station's network of service passages. Blade fired the sidearm. The UV burst caught it across the upper back, producing a reaction that confirmed UV sensitivity, as the creature's skin darkened and blistered along the exposure line and it collapsed against the hatch. 2 down. Kos hadn't moved. It stood in the corridor's center, watching him with the focused attention of a species that was recalibrating its threat assessment in real time. "You're the dominant one," Blade said. "You're not going to run." "Running is no longer optimal," Kos agreed. "The station is sealed. The others will be contained. 7 months of preparation." A pause that might have been frustration in something with a different face. "We underestimated the rate at which this environment could adapt." "Most people do," Blade said. The tendrils extended, all 6 of them, full deployment, bioluminescence shifting to a deep predatory red. At full extension they reached 4 meters. Blade had never fought a Vothkali at full capacity before. He was about to establish a data point. The first tendril came low. He stepped over it, inside its reach, and discovered that the second was the real attack. It looped rather than thrust, going for the back of the neck where the neural interface was most efficient. He dropped his shoulder, took the contact on the upper trapezius instead of the cervical spine. The feeding impulse hit immediately, not pain, the specific opposite of pain, a deep sedative euphoria designed to arrest resistance and prey. He'd been half vampire for his entire adult life. His nervous system had spent 3 decades learning to resist chemical and neurological intrusion. He pushed back. It lasted 4 seconds, the Vothkali feeding impulse meeting something it had no evolutionary framework for, a nervous system that was simultaneously prey and predator, that recognized the chemical signal and rejected it the way an immune system rejects a familiar pathogen. Kos recoiled, the tendril snapping back, and for the first time in the corridor something crossed its features that wasn't calculation. Uncertainty. Blade closed the 4 meters in less than a second and put it on the deck. Alive. Barely. He stood over the 3 unconscious Vothkali and activated his comm badge. Blade to Odo. 3 contained. Level 4 maintenance, Ring B, Junction 7. Security teams inbound, Odo said. The 4 stationary signatures are being surrounded now. Cisco wants them taken without. I heard him the first time, Blade said. He looked at the tendrils on the deck beside him, and then at the discoloration on his own shoulder where the feeding contact had landed. It would fade. Everything faded, given enough time. He waited for the security teams and did not think about how close 4 seconds had been. The 4 stationary Vothkali did not go quietly. They had been patient hunters for 7 months and they understood, when the station's internal sensors swept them with a frequency calibrated to their biology, that patience was no longer a viable strategy. 2 of them dropped their humanoid forms immediately and attempted to use the feeding impulse as a crowd weapon. Extending tendrils into open spaces on the promenade where the density of potential targets would force Starfleet to choose between pursuit and protecting civilians. It was tactically sound. It assumed Starfleet would prioritize the calculus the way it always had. It didn't account for Odo. The constable moved through the panicking crowd with the fluid efficiency of a being that had never needed to push past a body because he could reshape himself around it. He'd seen the Vothkali's crowd tactic forming from the upper level and had already positioned 3 security teams to contain the civilian flow outward while he moved inward. He reached the first extended tendril before it made contact with anyone, wrapped his hand around it, his hand reshaping to match the grip pressure required, and pulled the Vothkali off balance with the leverage of its own extended anatomy. The second one went for him directly, which was a mistake Kos would never have made. It had been holding a Dabo dealer's face for 6 weeks and thought in the Dabo dealer's approximate risk parameters. Odo was a shapeshifter. Neural electrical feeding required a stable nervous system to interface with. He went liquid at the moment of tendril contact and reformed behind the creature, and the security team behind him had a clear shot with the modified stasis emitters Bashir had configured in the last 90 minutes. 2 down on the promenade. The other 2 had gone for the Bajoran temple. It was, in its way, intelligently chosen. Starfleet's rules of engagement around religious sites created a hesitation window, and the Voth Kali had been on this station long enough to know it. They took 3 Bajoran civilians as proximity shields in the entrance corridor, tendrils partially extended, and made their position clear through the universal translator with the directness of a species that had decided negotiation was now its only remaining tool. They wanted a runabout. Unpiloted to the wormhole threshold, they would release the civilians on the other side. Kira, standing at the entrance with her phaser drawn and the specific stillness of a Bajoran woman for whom this temple was not a tactical consideration but something considerably more personal, looked at Cisco via combadge and said 2 words. "Your call." Cisco looked at the sensor display in ops. The 3 Voth Kali from the maintenance corridor were in containment. Koss was in the medical bay, restrained and under sedation after Blade had delivered him in a state that Bashir diplomatically described as requiring immediate attention. The wormhole was sealed, no outbound traffic authorized. If the 2 in the temple reached it, they'd need a ship to get through regardless. The runabout request was a delay tactic. They were buying time for something. "Blade," Cisco said. "What are they waiting for?" Blade was already at the temple corridor's secondary entrance, a maintenance access he'd identified from the station's schematics Odo had provided in the first hour. "Koss," he said. "They're waiting to see if Koss can get free. He's the dominant one. They won't commit to the wormhole without him. Koss is sedated and restrained. They don't know that yet." Blade looked at the secondary door. "Give me 90 seconds. "Blade," Cisco started. 90 seconds. "Then you do it by the book." There was a pause that lasted approximately 4 seconds and contained, Blade suspected, a considerable amount of internal deliberation. 80, Cisco said. Blade went through the maintenance door. The interior of the Bajoran temple was dim and fragrant, incense, woodwork, the specific quality of a space maintained with devotional care. The 3 civilians were near the altar, 2 adults and a child, held in the specific proximity that kept the Voth Kali's feeding impulse available as a deterrent. The 2 creatures stood between them and the main entrance, watching the door they expected threat to come through. Blade came through the wall panel behind the altar. The first one registered him in the half-second before he reached it and got a tendril up. He took the contact on his forearm, felt the euphoria hit, and dismissed it with the efficiency of someone who'd practiced the neurological rejection in the maintenance corridor 20 minutes ago. His elbow came down on the tendril's joint and the stasis emitter he'd taken from Odo's equipment locker discharged at contact range. The creature went rigid and down. The second one released the civilians immediately, not as a gesture of compliance, but to have both hands free. It was faster than its companion, and it had learned from Koss's mistake. It went for Blade's neck rather than his extremities, a full deployment tackle that took them both into the altar railing, wood cracking under the impact. The feeding impulse hit at maximum intensity, 6 tendrils, full contact, the Voth Kali's complete neurological arsenal directed at a nervous system it believed would collapse within seconds. Blade's nervous system had other opinions. He'd explained it to Bashir that morning in clinical terms. The Dhampir biology produced a counter-resonance to neural electrical feeding, not immunity, but resistance, the way certain plants produce toxins that deter predation without being immune to consumption. The Voth Kali felt it the same way Koss had. A prey that fed back. Not by choice or ability, by biology. By being exactly what he was. The creature recoiled. Blade brought the stasis emitter up and fired. Silence. He sat up from the floor of the Bajoran temple, breathing carefully, and looked at the 2 rigid forms on the stone. The civilians were against the far wall, the child pressed against an adult's side, all 3 watching him with expressions that ranged from shock to the dawning particular expression of people who understand they are alive because something intervened. He stood. Retrieved the stasis emitter. activated his comm badge. "All 7 contained," he said. His shoulder ached where Kaz had fed. His forearm ached where the tendril joint had snapped against it. Neither was serious. "Confirmed," Cisco said. And then, after a moment, "Good work." Blade looked at the temple's altar, the Bajoran iconography, the carefully tended lamp that had somehow survived the fight still burning. "Tell Kira her temple's intact," he said. "Mostly." 3 days after the containment of the Voth-Kali, Deep Space Nine had returned to something that resembled its normal operational state. The 6 comatose crew members were recovering. Bashir's prognosis was cautiously optimistic, neuropathway regeneration proceeding at a rate that suggested full cognitive restoration within weeks for 5 of the 6. The 6th, the young Bajoran woman Blade had stood beside in the medical ward, would take longer. Her pathways had been accessed the most times and with the most precision. Bashir was characteristically unwilling to assign a timeline he couldn't support with data. He was less characteristically quiet about it. Lieutenant Reyes was also in the medical bay. Her neural degradation was reversible. The Voth-Kali's sustained microfeeding had taken from the top layer rather than the core. But recovery required rest, nutritional support, and a series of neurological treatments that Bashir had developed partly from Blade's description of the feeding mechanism and partly from the Cardassian intelligence files Garrick had provided. She'd been told what had happened to her. She'd processed it with the steadiness of someone whose alarm responses were still partially muted, which Bashir noted was simultaneously a medical concern and a short-term mercy. The 7 Voth-Kali were in containment. Specialized cells that Odo had modified with shielding that disrupted the tendril extension mechanism, a solution Blade had suggested and Odo had implemented with the focused efficiency of someone who enjoyed solving unfamiliar engineering problems. They were alive. They were fed. Bashir had synthesized a neural electrical substrate from the Cardassian research data that satisfied their biological requirements without requiring a sentient host. They were communicating with a Federation legal team through a translator matrix that was still being refined. Kaz had not spoken since his capture. He sat in his cell and regarded his captors with the patience of a species that measured time differently than its jailers. Blade found this less troubling than Odo did. A patient predator in a secure cell was a predator that had already accepted its containment was real. It was the impatient ones who were still looking for the door. Cisco called Blade to his office on the morning of the 4th day. The office had a quality that Blade had noticed in the spaces of people who'd held authority long enough to stop performing it: functional, personal in small ways, the desk of someone who worked at it rather than staged behind it. The baseball on the corner had seen better decades. Blade sat across from Cisco and waited. "The Federation legal team is going to be here within the week," Cisco said. "The Voth-Kali will be tried under Federation law. The charges are significant: predatory assault, unlawful detainment, neural violation of 7 individuals. The Cardassian Union is requesting access to the Obsidian Order's research data as joint property. Bajoran spiritual authorities want to make a formal statement about the temple incident." He paused. "It's going to be complicated." "It always is," Blade said. "The dimensional rift that brought you here." Cisco opened a PDD. Dax has been analyzing the residual Cherenkov radiation signature. She believes it was a one-way event. The Cardassian weapon that caused it was destroyed in the detonation. Replicating the conditions would require a level of technical precision we can't currently guarantee. He looked up. "We don't know how to send you home." Blade absorbed this without visible reaction. He had been aware of the possibility since the first hour. Dimensional apertures didn't keep office hours. Dax also found something else, Cisco continued. The Voth-Kali's own transit records, recovered from a data chip Odo found on Kaz, indicate they entered this sector through the wormhole. From the Gamma Quadrant. Which means there's a population node in the Gamma Quadrant that neither the Dominion nor the Federation has identified. He set the PDD down. "That's a problem that isn't going away when the legal team arrives." "No," Blade agreed. "It's not. Cisco was quiet for a moment. I'm not going to pretend the Federation has a straightforward place for someone with your abilities and your methods. Our protocols exist for reasons that matter to us, even when they're inconvenient. He met Blade's eyes directly. But this station is at the edge of a war, adjacent to a wormhole that connects two quadrants, with a predator species we didn't know existed until 4 days ago operating somewhere in the Gamma Quadrant. And I have 6 people in the medical bay whose neural pathways were consumed while my sensors showed nothing. A pause. I'm not a man who ignores what worked. Blade looked at him. You're offering something. I'm suggesting a conversation. One that involves Starfleet Command, a legal framework for your operational presence in Federation space, and a formal mission to assess the Gamma Quadrant Voth Kali situation before the Dominion War makes it irrelevant or catastrophic. Cisco leaned back slightly. You'd operate within my authority. Not a prisoner. Not fully autonomous either. Your rules, Blade said flatly. My rules, Cisco confirmed. Except in circumstances where your rules are the only ones that work. Which we've already established as a category that exists. Blade was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the station's ambient hum filled the silence comfortably. He thought about his reality, the one where vampires moved through human populations like a disease without a name, where the hunters were always outnumbered and the night was always winning by inches. He thought about what it meant to be in a universe that at least knew something was wrong, that had sensors and protocols and Starfleet officers who updated their bioscan calibration within 90 minutes of being given new parameters. He thought about what was on the other side of the wormhole. I want Odo as my direct liaison, he said finally. Nobody else. Cisco almost smiled. He'll be delighted. He won't, Blade said. But he'll be effective. He stood. I need my weapons back. All of them. Already arranged, Cisco said. Blade moved to the door and stopped. Something crossed his face that wasn't quite comfort, and wasn't quite its opposite. A man recalibrating what his life was supposed to look like. Commander, he said. The Voth Kali in that temple. When I went in, I could have killed both of them in the time it took to reach for the stasis emitters. I know, Cisco said. I want that noted somewhere. Cisco picked up the baseball and turned it once in his hand. It is, he said. It has been since the moment you came through that dimensional rift and sheathed your blades. Blade left without another word. Behind him, the baseball made a small sound as Cisco set it back on the desk. The quiet percussion of a man who had just made a decision he hoped he wouldn't regret. In the medical bay, the lamp in the Bajoran temple was still burning. In the weeks that followed, Deep Space Nine filed 7 separate incident reports, 3 diplomatic communications, and 1 unprecedented biological classification request with Starfleet Medical. The Voth Kali became the Federation's most significant xenobiological discovery of the year, a predator species ancient enough to have predated Bajoran recorded history, intelligent enough to have hidden within a Starfleet installation for 7 months, and dangerous enough to require an entirely new category of bioscan protocol across all Federation vessels and starbases. Blade remained aboard DS9. He didn't call it home. He called it operational. The distinction mattered to him and Odo, who had spent his own lifetime understanding the particular discomfort of not belonging entirely to any world, chose not to challenge it. The wormhole continued to pulse open and closed on its ancient schedule, indifferent to what waited on either side. Somewhere in the Gamma Quadrant, a predator species older than the Federation had watched 7 of its kind disappear into the Alpha Quadrant and not return. They would send others. They always did. Blade knew this. It was, in the end, the only certainty his life had ever offered him, that the dark produced more, that the work was never finished, and that the only meaningful question was whether the hunter was ready when it began again. He sharpened his blades. He checked his serum supply. He waited. Live long and prosper. Hit the subscribe button for more interesting stories. Thank you for watching.